Mike was a CEO. He faced some incredible decisions one day, which actually came out of nowhere. He had been the CEO of the company for 6 years, and during that time, he had gained respect from the people that were following him. People were very nice to him in the hall and in the office, until this day. This day, he was faced with two decisions that went against his biblical convictions. And if he vetoed these two convictions, it would probably cost him his job. It's at this time that Mike finally saw that people were being skeptical of his leadership. Meanwhile, Pastor Edwards was a pastor at a church for 2 years. He had put a lot of time and energy into this church and spent a lot of time in counseling and intensive study for these people. Well, at the end of these 2 years, he was blindsided by its deacons. The deacons came in and asked him to resign. It broke his heart. He had spent all this time for these people, and then he was asked to leave. Although in two different positions, both men, Mike and Pastor Edwards, were trying to lead people who had no desire to follow their leadership. Anyone who has attempted to be a spiritual leader can sympathize with these two, especially Mike, the CEO. He took a hit for basing his decisions on his convictions. One would think it would be different in the body of Christ. Unfortunately, many times it proves to be just as difficult. The CEO and the pastor were faced with similar decisions. There is heartache in trying to be a spiritual leader. Spiritual leadership does not come easy in the secular world or in the church house. Spiritual leaders, in fact, face major challenges. There are two specific challenges that they face. Number one is skepticism of the followers. Think to the Old Testament with Moses. There's no doubt that Moses had the call of God on his life. In fact, there may not be a greater subjective call than Moses' call in the Old Testament. I mean, the angel of the Lord was speaking to him out of a burning bush, and he told him that he was the one that he wanted to go back to Egypt and deliver his people. So Moses goes back to Egypt, and imagine this. God uses him to perform 10 plagues there that would be assigned to the Jews and to the Egyptians alike. God worked through the man Moses. And God used Moses as a servant to represent him before Pharaoh. The Israelites had seen God's very stamp of approval on Moses. But they were still skeptical and still critical of his leadership. In Exodus 14, at the very brink of the Red Sea, they start complaining. And they said unto Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. Moses faced skepticism right before the Exodus and during the Exodus. In fact, in number 16, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram led a rebellion up against him. They claimed Moses led them out of Egypt, again, just so they could die in the wilderness. Moses faced significant undeserved criticism and skepticism, but God affirmed Moses' authenticity of spiritual leadership. God caused the ground to open up underneath the rebels. Not only did they perish, all their belongings perished. The most significant hurdle that any spiritual leader faces is not whether or not he has the ability to lead. The biggest hurdle they face is skepticism from their followers. There are 3 areas of leadership that have increased the skepticism. The first area is political leadership. We think only a few months back, the governor of Illinois, after Barack Obama won the election to be the next president of the United States, the governor was taking bribes to who would fill his Senate seat. And then we also think back to the 90s, the Clinton scandals. And because of all those scandals, sketch comedy boomed in the 90s because people started mimicking political leaders. Blackaby states, Society longs for statesmen, but it gets politicians. Statesmen are leaders who uphold what is right regardless of the popularity of the position. People are crying out for statesmen, people that will do right and just be honest, but they're getting politicians. So political leadership adds to skepticism, but business leadership also adds to skepticism. All we have to do is think of terms like Enron, Martha Stewart, America's favorite housekeeper, and then we think of pyramid schemes in business. So business also adds to skepticism of leadership. But probably the most sad and unfortunate one of all is church leadership. Just a couple years ago, Ted Haggart, the president of the National Evangelical Association, it was brought out that he was involved in a homosexual scandal. And then we think decades back to cultists. Cultists are still around today, but we think of people like Jim Jones, the Jonestown Massacre. 913 people were massacred. Over 200 of them were kids. And leaders today, spiritual leaders, are ministering to people that remember those events. They remember that cults are out there. But also, in the church leadership, there's monetary scandals. You have faith healers like Peter Popoff and other people that all you have to do is sow your seed of a check of $27 and then send a few more checks, and you'll start being blessed. People are skeptical because of political leaders, business leaders, and now church leaders. Spiritual leaders face some major challenges. Number one, they face skepticism from their followers. Number two, they face worldly methodology is preferred over biblical methodology. Think back to 1 Samuel 8. In 1 Samuel 8, Israel comes to Samuel and says, Samuel, we realize that you're old, and your sons don't have the character you have. So why don't you give us a king so we can be like all the other nations? And so God tries his best to tries to talk them out of it and tells them what exactly they'll get. This king will take their sons away, their daughters away, their slaves away, their flocks away, their fields away. But they say, give us a king anyway so we can be like all the nations. They chose king over God. And in fact, God gave them what they wanted, but ultimately they lost what they had. And today, leaders are paying a price for choosing the secular over the biblical. Blackaby suggests that in the hunt for new methods, a biblical mindset has been lost. Blackaby states that churches now adopt mission statements instead of focusing on the Great Commission. Churches are paying a price for the emphasis on the secular. While churches and spiritual leaders are searching for secular principles, the secular leaders are interested in taking biblical principles and implementing them into their companies. So, spiritual leaders are missing, according to Blackaby, a great opportunity as people have a renewed interest in biblical principles. So spiritual leaders face a rough climate in this postmodern era. Does their responsibility bring more pressure than other time periods, other eras, other dispensations? Moses dealt with skepticism. The early days of the church ministered during an atrocious time of persecution. Preachers and teachers will face a more difficult time toward the end of the church age, because listeners will have itching ears and wanting to put up leaders to themselves just to tickle their ears. The call and responsibility given by God demands the faithfulness of spiritual leaders. So in summary, spiritual leaders face major challenges. They face skepticism from their followers. Skepticism is brought about by political leadership, business leadership, and now church leadership. People that claim to be ambassadors for Christ but are actually wolves. So spiritual leaders face skepticism from their followers, but they also face worldly methodology being preferred over biblical methodology. And so, just like Blackaby, we have a choice. Do we choose the biblical principles, or do we go with worldly methodology? Friends, let's go with God.